Sewage in our rivers. Is shoplifting out of control? And a 4-day week for Scottish civil servants. This is Politics Live. On the panel today, Conservative MP Ben Bradley, Labour peer Baroness Anderson, David Linden from the SNP and The Sun's political editor Natasha Clark. So what's going on today?
Does anyone ever say, you know what, you've done a good job because everyone else has sat on their and done nothing? No signs of that, no?
As schools grapple with crumbling concrete, are cracks showing in the government's handling of the crisis? Why is so much sewage being pumped into our rivers by water companies?
Welcome to the River Lavant, or as we locally call it, the River Lav.
The River Lav.
The River Lav, just full of effluent.
The message is very clear from the public. They're fed up of the sewage. I am too. But we are going to have that extra investment to make sure it gets delivered.
And is shoplifting out of control? Retailers say the number of cases has soared in a year, with thieves becoming more violent.
People are more accepting of violence in society today. I think with the economic situation, more people are desperate, so they are willing to use violence to get the items that they need.
Well, you heard Gillian Keegan, the Education Secretary, in the headlines. Let's have a look at the front page of the Daily Telegraph with this. Concrete crisis and hot mic rant leave Keegan fighting for survival. Starting with you, Ben, does Gillian Keegan's sweary outburst tell us anything about her suitability for the job as Education Secretary?
That probably tells us that Cabinet Ministers are human beings. I don't think that's a bad thing. I feel a bit for Gillian, if I'm honest, because this idea that all of this has just happened in the last few days is nonsense. I'm the council leader. We've been working on surveying school buildings as a result of DfE guidance for several years. We've done a good job of that. And as a result, when the guidance changed last week, we actually had a really good picture in England of what we needed to do. We've been able to mitigate that largely. The impact in my area is one primary school delayed by a couple of days in return. That's it. So to have Labour MPs, media coming out saying that schools are death traps and whatever does not reflect reality, and I think is a really problematic place for this kind of rhetoric to be. So I do feel for Gillian in that circumstance, actually.
What's your view, Ruth? Does it tell you anything about Gillian Keegan's suitability for the job?
Well, she'd probably get detention if she was in any of the schools that she was responsible for. But look, the reality is this isn't about her. She's irrelevant, and she's proven herself to. She is, because this is about kids, and this is about children that are meant to have started school yesterday, today and tomorrow. In North Staffordshire, where I live, we're still waiting for surveys. The DfE sent out, well, I appreciate the guidance changing last week, but the DfE sent out a new survey, their, I don't know, 4th, 5th survey, a new survey on the 18th of August, expecting head teachers to reply by the 23rd. I think they'll find that most primary heads may have been on annual leave over that period. The idea that you can give this little notice to teachers, to heads, and say, oh, you know, it's OK. And when we find out the detail behind this, the fact that schools haven't been rebuilt, the fact that the Prime Minister, when he was Chancellor, cut the budget, these are the consequences of 13 years of Tory failure, and now we're living with it. And her rant just sort of puts it all into context, really.
Right, David, do you want to respond, Ben?
It's just not true. I think, again, go back to my own circumstance. In Manchester, we're having 4 schools rebuilt, which is fantastic. £9 million investment in our school estate from the County Council, significant government money going into our school estate. And actually, you look at Labour's record on school rebuilding, it built far fewer schools a year than the 50 a year that government is committed to.
We've not had 50, we've had 4. Oh, hold on a second. Since 2020, we've had 4 new rebuilds. We've been promised hundreds by 2030. We're seeming we might get them now because of the emergency.
Saddled with PFI debt
and I've got. You can't, on the one hand, say PFI debt and then say we didn't rebuild any schools.
Fewer than 50 that government's doing.
In Stoke-on-Trent, we haven't. In my city, I don't want to tempt fate, but we haven't had any of this yet because Building Schools for the Future continued.
Right.
In Wales, where we continued the Building Schools for the Future programme, 2 schools are having to shut in the whole of the country.
Because they have no data.
That's just simply not true. 23% increase in budget, not
I'm going to stop you. We can listen here to the politics, obviously, of this debate. How much pressure is the government under? And I'll come to David finally on Gillian Keegan.
They are now. This scandal about ROAC, this reinforced concrete, has been known about for a very long time. And I think, Nick Gibb, the schools minister, admitted as such on the radio today when he was talking about making representations to the Treasury about extra funding for this. There's obviously been a little bit of a back and forth about exactly what was asked for, what was promised from the government at the time, and Rishi Sunak when he was Chancellor. But, obviously this is, again, another decision from Rishi Sunak that's coming back to bite him, because he has been the person that's been in charge of these budgets for a very, very long time and been in charge of hearing all those representations. We know this has been a problem for a very long time, and it seems like only over the summer has this increased risk guidance been updated. But yes, it doesn't look good for the government just days before kids are going back to school to be plunged into this crisis. And even if it is only a few, 1,500 schools, it's still a lot of parents and a lot of disruption for parents right this time.
What did you make of Gillian Keegan's outburst? Straight talking, or does it mean that she isn't suitable for the role?
I think probably it shows that the mask is slipping from the government. I mean, this government lurches from crisis to crisis every single day, and I think what you see in the front pages of today's newspaper is a government that's now out of touch, out of ideas, and not dealing with the issues that parents care about. I'm a dad of 2 young kids that are at school today. I just want to make sure that my kids are safe at school, and unfortunately the news narrative is about a UK government minister who is completely losing the plot, not reassuring parents, and not actually speaking to the issues that families really care about right now, which is the cost of living crisis and making sure their kids don't go to school that's going to collapse.
Let's talk about rivers and sewage, because as the weather heats up again, many people will be looking to enjoy a swim in the UK's rivers and seas. At the same time, the BBC's been investigating illegal sewage spills in England's waterways. Let's speak to the BBC's environment correspondent, Jonah Fisher, who's been looking into this. Hello to you, Jonah. What do you make of the data that you've looked at from water companies?
Well, basically, we were trying to answer a pretty simple question. Out of all the sewage discharges that took place last year, a figure of more than 300,000 was published by the Environment Agency when it compiled all of the different water companies together. How many of them were legal and how many of them were illegal? Companies are allowed to discharge sewage into our seas and waterways if the system is overwhelmed, if there's been heavy rain and sea. So we requested information from all the water companies. 3 of them got back to us with all the stop and start times for their raw sewage discharges. And then we did a massive number crunch, basically. We put all of that data together with weather data, rainfall data, to try and work out which of those spills had taken place during dry weather. And the figure we came up with, remember, just for 3 out of the 9 companies, is that last year there was just under 400 what looked like illegal dry spills taking place.
What is actually going to be done, or if anything at all, to fix this issue?
Good question. And when we spoke to both the government and to Water UK, the answer was pretty clear. It was going to be an awful lot of money, that there would have to be massive investment. The water industry has already put together proposals for billions of pounds of investment over the next few years to try and modernise the creaking sewage infrastructure and pipe system here. Of course, if they're going to get lots of money to fund this, they're going to have to raise our bill. So that will be the awkward conversation which has to take place. How much will bills have to rise if we're going to truly modernise the sewage system around the UK so that this sort of discharges, whether they be legal or illegal, don't take place anymore?
All right, well, we're going to talk about that in just a moment. Jonah Fisher, thank you very much. Well, here is a pretty stark example of the amount of investment versus debt. If you have a look at this graph in terms of total water company investment, look at the red line. That is showing water company borrowing rising, surging, in fact, to about £60 billion in debt. Now have a look at the blue line, which represents the amount of capital expenditure or investment. It's under 10 billion, 5 billion in comparison. Ben, looking at that graph, would you say privatisation of the water industry has worked?
Well, it's a complex question that hasn't got a simple answer. I think
Just looking at that graph, the difference...
Well, that graph doesn't explain the entire story of privatisation, does it? But I think the Environment Secretary will be very clear that she expects the private sector to do some of this investment. She's said that herself in the last few days. Yeah. But it's also clear, I mean, the reason we have this data, the reason we're able to get this monitoring is because this government is the first in the 150-year history of our sewage system to actually step up and try to monitor and tackle this. So we are putting that investment in, but changing huge national infrastructure is not something that happens overnight. It will take time to deliver.
When you say we, the water companies are putting the investment in. You can see here from this figure, I mean, breaking it down, £74 billion have been paid to shareholders since privatisation. £60 million has been spent on pay and bonuses in the last 5 years. Do you trust the private water companies to manage this?
I think they need to do more. I can only speak to my experience with our local water company, Severn Trent, who are quite open with us as MPs. We meet them regularly. But I know some are better than others. I know the Environment Secretary is trying to put that pressure on them to invest more. And it's very clear that they need to take some responsibility for this, that they need to put some of that investment in. It shouldn't just be for bill payers and taxpayers. But at the same time, you could magic up that money tomorrow. The work itself to improve that infrastructure will still take years, so it's not something that can be fixed overnight.
Is renationalising England's water industry the answer?
I think at this point we'd be inheriting yet another huge mess that this government would have left us. I think it's not going to be as straightforward as that. We're going to be really sensible with government finance as we go forward, and if it's about buying out investors or investing in the infrastructure, we're going to have to be sensible about the decisions that we make. But we're going to have to be really clear about why we didn't. As a child, we're not of dissimilar ages. I can't ever remember these stories. These stories have come in the last 5 to 10 years.
But is that to do with monitoring, as Ben Bradley said? There's been more monitoring, so we know about it.
There may be some monitoring, but the Environment Agency that oversees enforcement, their budget has been cut from 170 million when we were last in government to 94 million today, and that's after an increase from last year. We haven't had data and we haven't had enforcement, and they've been able to get away with murder.
Well, and on that basis, then, isn't nationalisation the answer?
I think at this point, actual regulation might be a good start, and actually enforcement, and then having very clear guidance for what that enforcement should look like, and automatic fines for the companies that have broken the law, and these companies have broken the law.
We just launched at the end of last year our plan for water, which includes new fines and regulations, which includes kind of hammering the water companies who are making those illegal discharges. Some of them are allowed, and there's time that needs to be taken to deal with the infrastructure. Others are illegal, and there's ongoing criminal investigations right now into water companies with record fines now on the table for people who break the rules.
Can I just very quickly come back on that? You've actually launched 4 water plans this summer, all of which are a rehash of the last ones. You've talked about it. You've not done very much. Each one's a new plan. You may be consistency, but nothing's actually happened. This is nonsense. This is failing the country.
150 years.
This is failing the country.
This is the first government ever to try and fix this.
I can't ever remember stories of people doing triathlons who have got ill from swimming in the water.
Right, coming back to the question, because Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, did, in his leadership campaign, say nationalising the water industry was the answer, along with other utilities. Why has he changed his mind?
We had no idea of the mess that we were going to inherit. And the reality is, even today, we haven't got a list of the schools that we're going to have to rebuild when we're next in government. We don't even know how much money we're going to have to spend on rebuilding infrastructure because of the mess we're inheriting from this Conservative government. So in terms of spending commitments, I trust Rachel Reeves will do everything she can in a fiscally prudent way to rebuild our country.
David?
Well, I think if you go out on the beach, one of the things you're going to find are the flip-flops from Keir Starmer, because since he became Labour leader, he has flip-flopped in just about everything. The situation in Scotland's different. We have Scottish Water in public hands because we do not believe that it should be run for the benefit of the private sector or for profit. It should be in the hands of the public. We are not immune to this either. The Scottish Environment Protection Agency regulates this, and we've seen the rating for good and high-quality water go from 82% to 87% in the last 6 years. We must go further, and that's why Scottish Water has committed another £500 million in that infrastructure investment, because we don't think that money should be in the hands of shareholders. It should go into the public good.
Well, that's clear, but is it actually working, David? That's the point, because in May, data from Scottish Water, the state-owned water company you're talking about, revealed that the total volume of recorded waste released in Scotland was just over 47 million cubic metres, enough to fill almost 19,000 Olympic swimming pools, and up by 35% in 12 months. Does that show it's working?
Well, I think one of the things that shows we've got more to do, and that's why the CPA figures that show that we've gone from 82% to 87% are good. But what you need to do is you need to put your money where your mouth is. And that's why Scottish Water are investing £500 million to try and deal with some of the infrastructure issues, to make sure that the beautiful beaches and rivers that we've got in Scotland can be more beautiful. Right,
but being publicly owned hasn't actually improved the situation that much. According to the Marine Conservation Society, only 3.4% of storm overflows are monitored. Perhaps you just don't know what the full picture is and reported on in Scotland. The situation
Well, I think
worse.
the fact that it's publicly owned is because that you're seeing the Scottish Water coming forward with that £500 million investment rather than giving it back to dividends to shareholders as Labour and the Tories would do.
Who should pay for all of this, Natasha?
I think our readers would say the water companies themselves, rather than the taxpayers and the bill payers. And I think that is going to be the argument about who is going to pay for all this money. And 500 million, while a good start, is going to be nowhere near the amount of money. I think the government have estimated it will be billions and billions
about
over many years to basically just to stop storm overflows. In the condition that they're already in. So it's obviously going to be an issue for the next election. Obviously, all parties are going to be trying to weigh in on this. And this is an example of Rishi Sunak to say, well, I'm going to be, doing those long-term decisions that everybody says are incredibly unpopular. But now they really are coming to the forefront. And, a couple of 500 million, just not enough to sort all of this out.
Right. I mean, who is going to foot the bill of this 20 billion? If you wanted to rebuild the whole infrastructure...
Well, it's going to have to be a combination of both, isn't it?
Yeah, so
of both the private sector and you can argue about where the private sector get that funding from. There'll no doubt be a conversation with government about that. There'll have to be some government investment in this as well, because it is a huge infrastructure project and it will take time. But we've already seen the start of that. And I think it's next year that the kind of new Thames sewage infrastructure comes online. That's our dirtiest river in England. And that is in itself a £1 billion, several-year project. So it's not going to be quick or cheap.
Right. Who do you think should pay? I mean, should we all have to foot those bills? Pay more?
I don't think we should, but
they've already
I think
said
in
that
the
they're
round...
going to put up bills to pay for this. All the water companies have already said that this is going to have to be something that's going to be paid for, and that's on top of bills already rising this year and on top of a cost of living crisis.
And on top of their overriding debt portfolios already.
Right. I mean, so how else do you do it then?
I think we're going to have to look at everything in the round, because while this is just about, while we're talking about sewage, actually we've got bigger issues that we've got, not bigger, but we've also got issues to do in terms of water management as the climate's changing. So we're going to have to look about our water supply system at the same time as we're looking at sewage to make sure this works properly and that we're talking about mass investment.
These are the realities, right? There is no such thing as an easy answer to this or a quick or cheap answer to this. No government minister sits in a room full of easy options to solve these things and just ignores them. They are complicated and expensive decisions that you've got to weigh up against health funding and everything else.
The fact that it's being dealt with in boardrooms and driven by profit rather than in ministerial departments.
I really don't think across all of these sectors, whatever you want to talk about, public or private is not the real question in this. It's about what you're doing to tackle this stuff. And there's a question about where funding comes from and how the system works, of course. But public or private is not the big difference. We've just had the conversation about it. It doesn't make a great deal of difference between England or Scotland as to whether it's public or privately owned. The question is, what are you going to do and what is the plan? We've released a plan. We've started the plan in terms of infrastructure investment around the Thames, and that will grow over time.
David?
Well, I think that what you see is the political pressure on government ministers means it leads to some form of action. If the political pressure is only in the boardroom, the chances of it being kind of high in the agenda is fairly low.
Right, but what is the evidence to really show categorically that putting it in public ownership is a better, more efficient and more successful way of managing the water?
Well, it's this unique, novel view that I think until fairly recently even the Labour Party had, that national infrastructure should be in the hands of government and politicians, not in the hands of shareholders who are only interested in making a profit.
Right.
I think that in an ideal world, that's exactly where we want to be, but that is not what the world looks like now. And some of these issues are because we are now going to have to rebuild 13 years of misinvestment, 13 years of not having enforcement. Yeah, but no investment over the last 13 years in it. It's like you woke up yesterday and thought, oh, you know what we should do? Probably is a good idea that effluent doesn't go in the Thames.
13 years of government.
When hold on a second. When we left government, we had the cleanest rivers since the Industrial Revolution. What have you done with that legacy?
Invested massively in actually getting the data to show that that's not true.
Oh, so that doesn't come from the Labour Party. That comes from the NAO. That comes from the Environment Agency.
Natasha, last week the government announced it would be relaxing regulations around house building, a move that's been criticised by environmental campaigners because those regulations are intended to prevent pollution to rivers. What is the government strategy here? Because they are saying that it could lead to 100,000 more homes being built and there is a shortage.
Exactly, and I think it's another example of the balancing act that has to be struck of government decisions. Essentially, it shouldn't obviously be a binary choice between protecting our environment and building more houses. And the government believed that 100,000 extra houses could be built by relaxing these nutrient rules essentially around how much water pollution comes in from new houses. That's their argument. Obviously, the Conservatives know we've got a housing crisis. Labour obviously are going to have to deal with that issue as well when they come in. And it's a balancing act. And I think, it's just, like I say, just what Ben said earlier, it just shows that there's no such thing as an easy decision if we want to build houses and also protect our rivers. But just wanted to come back on your point from earlier. Obviously, the Conservatives have, lifted those caps on fines, I think, on water companies. So I think that might be something that will really help, kick the water companies into action, because it's going to hit them in the profits.
Is that a worthwhile trade-off?
No, one of the things I would say on that, I get frustrated sitting in Westminster listening to both parties talking about housing, because you cannot have this conversation about housing and the housing shortage that we have on these islands without confronting the fact that if you build social housing, you can't then sell it off with the discredited right to buy, which is what leads to a lot of the supply problems.
But I'm talking about the trade-off between relaxing certain regulations in order to turbo boost house building.
Well, I'm old enough to remember that we were told that Brexit was about increasing standards, and it rather strikes me that since we left the European Union, everything's been about how do you, if you pardon the pun, water down standards. Well, which is not what we're promised.
And then we'll move on.
Obviously, I think that's nonsense. But the trade-off, you're right, is we've got a growing population, a massive housing shortage, a challenge with all sorts of infrastructure, not just sewage. And in order to invest, in order to build, that comes with pollution, and that is a difficult balance government has to strike.
We have got a real crisis in terms of a shortage of house building. Is it worth looking at relaxing some regulations in order to boost it?
I sat through the recent debate on the retained EU law bill, where we were promised day in, day out that they would not cut environmental standards. And within a matter of weeks, that's exactly what they're proposing to do. I don't think that this is the answer, and I don't think that building 100,000 extra houses, this is the way to do it. We have a huge amount of brownfield site that can be invested in. That could be cleared up. We have empty homes that we could have empty homes that could be reutilised. There's lots of different ways we could do this. This is not imaginative. This is an easy solution.
Let's have a look at this headline and talk about shoplifting. It says in The Independent, police must have zero tolerance policy to shoplifting. It's the report on comments by Chris Philp, Home Office Minister, the Policing Minister, saying that officers should take this sort of approach. It comes after Tesco said frontline staff would be fitted with body cameras after a rise in violent shoplifting offences. Let's talk to Michelle Whitehead. She works at a grocery store in the West Midlands. Hello to you, Michelle. Tell us of your experience of shoplifting.
There's that many. I don't know where you want me to start. I suppose I'll go with the recent one. We've got a gentleman coming in daily, pinching all our meat and bacon. But it's not what they're doing to us. I had a customer have a go at me yesterday because she blames me for not having stock on the shelf. She says I ought to do something about the shoplifting.
Has it got a lot worse in recent months, or has it always been like this?
No, I've been in retail over 20 years and it's got worse, and it is getting worse. And I think it's because we have no power to do anything. They then come in, they can fill their bags up and then they can go. And we have to stand there and watch them while they call us names, laugh at us and push us.
When you say you can't do anything about it, what do you mean? You never try and engage with these people? And if you do they show any remorse?
No, we're not allowed to touch them. We're not allowed to approach them at all. That's most companies' policies, because they says don't put yourself in danger, because you actually don't know what these people have got in their pockets. So we can't touch them. They can just come in, come out, take what they want. They're basically laughing at us.
And what about the customers
it is.
Yeah, go on.
No, it's frustrating. It's upsetting. It really is.
No, I can imagine. Are there security guards in your store? Are there cameras watching? Do you report it to the police?
We do. We report every incident. We have a portal at work. We've got security guards that are called roaming officers, which means they do a hell of a lot of stores for our company. We haven't got a specific one all the time. So we do have them sometimes, but not all the time. And we do report it. And we report it to the police as well, but do the police turn up? Very rarely. There's not enough of them on the ground. And they don't class it as a serious crime.
Right, OK, so they don't class it as a serious crime. What do you think needs to be done? What would stop people shoplifting in the way they're doing so at the moment?
I think we need to follow Scotland, really, and get that bill brought in where it is an offence to shoplift. You get more for what you've done. And basically, we had a gentleman not long ago. He went to court. He got found guilty because he'd been coming in all the time. He left court at 12 o'clock. By 12:30, he was in our store shoplifting because they don't care. It just needs to be more serious. They need to be more. I've lost the words.
No,
it's just frustrating. I just want to cry. Do you know what I mean? I have to deal with this every day.
No, we can feel your frustration. Stay with us, Michelle, and listen to what our guests have to say about it. I'll come to the law in Scotland, or the new offence. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think it's really sad to hear, and Michelle and other shop workers shouldn't have to put up with that. I've worked in retail. My wife was a retail manager for a decade. She's literally rugby tackled people coming out of the store, which she shouldn't have to do.
No.
You know, and most stores will absolutely say don't engage, which is right. I think there's a real challenge here, not necessarily about the legislation, because we've introduced tougher sentences around aggravated assaults on shop workers, those kinds of things, but it's enforcement, right? And that is a challenge that Chris Philpott, the Minister, has called on police to tackle. I don't think we can get to a place, which Michelle has described, where people can feel like they can just get away with this and there are no consequences. That's about sentencing, it's about police enforcement of this, which we can push the police to do. There are also local partnerships on this. I know in my constituency, councils, police, the business investment district have security guards, and they all work together to try and tackle this on the ground.
But what's driving this? I mean, Michelle says they don't care. People don't care. They're just helping themselves.
I think that we'll be seeing a whole range of reasons why people are doing it. A lot of this is going to be related to the cost of living. Other of this is the fact the criminal justice system is failing. If people can't afford to eat, they're going to take food, and I think we've got to recognise the challenges that we're currently living through as a society. But one of the things I agree with you completely about enforcement, but we've got 10,000 fewer neighbourhood police officers and no police presence than we did in 2010. So this is about investment in neighbourhood policing, and that where people are around on our high streets. I think it is ludicrous that the bids and our local high streets are having to club together to pay for security guards. This is meant to be policing. They can't prosecute. The police can. You can't ask the police to enforce this if there aren't enough of them.
I mean, is it realistic, though, to have every shoplifting crime investigated?
Possibly not, but I think that at the same time we do have to make sure that just because something's only 50 quid or whatever today, it doesn't mean it just slips under the radar. There has to be consequences, and that will scale up as the nature of offences scales up, right? But I don't buy into this view. I have to say that there's a cost of living challenge to this. Most acquisitional, there'll be an element of that, I'm sure, but most acquisitional crime is drug related, and the police will tell you that. They're not. It's not, you know, mums stealing loaves of bread for children. This is people stealing things they can slip in a bag and sell, and a lot of that comes back to also how we tackle drugs and county lines, which has been a lot of work and investment in as well.
Right, well, let's have a look at this headline, The Telegraph. End the shoplifting scourge to restore trust in police. The government should ensure that officers are seen to fulfil their essential function of law enforcement, as you've been discussing. I think we can have a look at the headline in The Sun, in your paper, Natasha. The Sun says, soaring theft from shops is laying waste to our high streets and woke police have given up. What do you mean?
I think a lot of readers are quite concerned about reports that the police are spending their time dealing with other hate crimes and other things that they think are lower level incidents, and not spending enough time on what we call the bread and butter issue of policing, shoplifting, burglary, attacks on people. And I think that is what a lot of people are really fed up with. And obviously we're seeing it's really affecting our high streets. And that's something that the government obviously claim to really obviously care about, trying to boost that in terms of the economy. But, you know, when people are shoplifting things like meat from shops, that really does say to me, it's shoplifting has obviously changed. We had a report today in the Sun about people locking up duvets from Dunelm as well. Like, who is stealing duvets from Dunelm? Are they selling them as you say, Ben, like a crime? Is it sort of an organised crime thing, selling them on the black market, or is people selling, people shoplifting meat? Are they doing it because they can't feed themselves in terms of a cost of living crisis? But I think really it just sort of goes back to the idea that just things aren't working in this country, that people feel like that when they report a crime, the police don't come, that nothing is done about it, that they're worried that essentially the sort of social fabric of our lives is sort of fraying a little bit.
Ben?
Well, I agree on the priorities, and I think most of my constituents would and do find it incredibly frustrating when they see some of the things that police and other enforcement agencies spend their time on. A lot of they will give me and send me examples of you're prosecuting such and such for something they've said on Twitter, but you can't come out when my house has been burgled. I think, and that's not the fundamental issue, but I do think that the key thing the public would expect is that when those local things happen, the things that affect our day-to-day lives, whether it's burglary or theft or those kinds of things, that somebody shows up, and that should be number one priority.
Is that what you're seeing in Scotland, that the police are prioritising the wrong sort of issue or crime?
No, I mean, I think what we're seeing in Scotland, as Michelle alluded to, is in 2021, the Scottish Parliament passed the Retail Workers' Protection legislation, which ensures that we are dealing with this more robustly. And I think that's absolutely right. I think that Ruth probably hits the nail on the head, though, and we are having this conversation, and yeah, absolutely, there'll be chancers, opportunists, but we're in a ridiculous situation in 2023 when the Co-op have taken the decision to put baby formula behind the tills for fear of shoplifting. I don't think, hand on heart, that would be opportunists or chancers. That is the stage where mothers have been forced into a situation, wrongly, to shoplift simply to feed their babies. And in the fifth richest economy in the world, that is wrong and suggests that something is thoroughly broken in the United Kingdom.
So what does your offence protecting shop workers do to solve that?
It tries to ensure that there's more protection for the shop workers.
I understand that, but that's not answering your comments about society or about the fact that people, as you see it, are in a desperate situation.
I mean, essentially what you're trying to do is make sure that there's a tougher sentence, there's a tougher punishment there so that you can deter that. Now, I think that we're still
in the... Has it worked?
With the legislation only fairly recently received royal assent, I think it's going to be some time before we actually see how that plays out. But you cannot have this conversation in a vacuum from the cost of living crisis, which means that mothers are literally shoplifting formula milk just to feed their babies. That is wrong and suggests something
to that, there isn't there? Because those services to get that support exist, and there are places where those mothers could go and access free help and food and support and other kinds of support too.
Or, for example, the government and the Labour Party could commit to abolishing the two-child cap and rape clause. The fact that parents do not have enough money in their pockets and are resorting to stealing formula milk rather suggests that policy might not be working.
I mean, Ruth, do you think there should be a new offence?
I think that we saw physical assaults against Tesco workers in the last year go up by a third. We've seen attacks on shop workers double just since 2019. We need to protect shop workers. Absolutely, we need to ensure that there is huge deterrent. But all of this is irrelevant unless we can actually enforce it, unless we can prosecute. And with the state of our court system and with the 10,000 fewer neighbourhood police officers, that makes it almost impossible.
Well, you've mentioned violent incidents because it's not just the element of shoplifting, it is the violence that is increasing alongside it. Let's just have a look again at these rather shocking pictures of an incident at a supermarket in Bristol. You can see shop workers, they're trying to barricade themselves into the shop to keep out people trying to rob it. And in the end, they resort to total violence, which would, of course, be covered under assault crimes. But this is pretty shocking stuff, isn't it, Ben?
100%, and it's absolutely something that shop workers shouldn't have to deal with. You would like to think that in those circumstances, which is not cost of living related, that's drugs and organised crime and gangs related, that's the ones where you would hope every time the police are there to tackle that work and that CCTV leads to convictions. There's still a challenge around, I think, the lower level stuff, and there's still a challenge around the courts and sentencing. But we've also introduced in England that aggravated element to sentencing that means if that is the case against both shop workers and other public-facing workers, that would lead to a higher sentence.
What about a commitment to more police officers? I mean, Boris Johnson pledged to replace the 20,000 officers that were cut after the financial crash. Are you saying that you would invest and pay for more?
Yep, with the Labour Party's committed to 13,000 new community neighbourhood policing.
Paid
for by efficiencies within the current services, which the Police Foundation have said what we've budgeted for is 350 million. They've said that there's savings available of 690.
Right.
Closing all the police stations then?
I think you've already done that.
Well, that's a different issue, of course. David, though, one of the things that Michelle said is that one gentleman who had been prosecuted in court for shoplifting, he was back there the same day. So I'm not sure your protection of shop workers, yes, it would protect the shop workers, but it's not deterring people from doing it, is it? I mean, I know this wasn't in Scotland, but it doesn't seem to deter people. And he'd gone to court and been prosecuted.
Yeah, I think the jurisdiction that Michelle is speaking from, I think, if I recall correctly, was Wolverhampton. They don't have that legislation in statute. I think the thing that I would say is we all have to remember and have slightly longer memories that, you know, during the pandemic, we would all go out on our doorsteps on a Thursday night and clap for key workers. And that included the kind of people who were in those supermarkets and were being barricaded against. And so I think all of us, when we go to the supermarket, yes, there are frustrations about the fact that butter's now £4, but taking out that frustration on Tesco workers is utterly wrong, and I think in that we can all agree.
How big an issue at the election is it going to be? Crime, and perhaps what people might call is serious crime, but they might say it's lower-level crime issues.
I think it will be, and I know that Labour want to put this as part and parcel of their election offering, but obviously, you know, there's discussions going on within the Labour Party about how prominent crime will be. But yeah, I think the fact is that, you know, looking at most of the statistics, you can see that crime in many areas is going up, and the more people get affected by these day-to-day things, like getting your phone nicked, getting your bike nicked, and you go along to the police and you say, look, I can see that my bike's put on this website, and why aren't you doing anything about it? And I can find my phone to this guy around the corner, and he's got, clearly, obviously, he's not just got my phone, he's got loads of them, and it is linked to these organised crime links. If people can't see that justice being done, and people feel like when they report something to the police, nothing happens and their case just gets closed, then this is going to be a really important issue for all parties at the next election.
Michelle, you already said that you would like to see a similar fence brought in England and Wales to the one that's been introduced in Scotland. But what do you make of what you've heard from the panel today?
I think they need to come and spend a day as a shop worker because it's lots of words. It is horrific. It really is at the moment. So please come and spend a day in my shop and see how you get on with the shoplifters and the abuse that we have to suffer every day.
Michelle Whitehead, thank you very much. Well, there's an invitation to both of you.
Worked in Aldi for a year.
Did you?
My wife used to be the manager.
Did you have any of these sorts of...
We did, yeah. And we had to tackle it. As you say, you know, you get told not to intervene, but it's difficult to do that when you can see it and trip somebody over or whatever on the way out. And we've done that, right? My wife, as I say, has been doing things she shouldn't do in that scenario and putting herself at risk. And it is really difficult. So, you know, regardless of whether you've been there or not, and, you know, Michelle should know that we all recognise that.
Also worked in retail. I worked in Debenhams when it, you know, existed.
A little while ago. Let's have a look at this headline in the Herald. Humza Yousaf, the First Minister, Scotland to pilot 4-day working week in key Holyrood speech. Yes, he's going to confirm, we expect, this trial of civil servants for the first time in Scotland. How will it work, David?
Well, I think at the moment what we see is we're building back better from COVID. We cannot just go back to doing the same. So I think there's going to be a 12-month trial to see if a 4-day week works. Anecdotally, I have it in my own office. My own office manager works a 4-day week, and what we see is productivity is up. And I think,
is it?
Yeah, I would say so. And the evidence that is out there is fairly limited at the moment, suggests it's worth exploring. But I think it's part of a wider fair work agenda that the Scottish Government have got. So, for example, the first government to commit to the accredited national living wage employer, making sure that we have a better relationship, for example, with trade unions. So it's all about how can you work towards that wellbeing economy, because this idea we expect people to just turn up to offices and work 9 to 5, 5 days a week, when, you know, if we can have better mental health outcomes, you know, it's worth doing. And I think that's what the First Minister's looking at today.
So can people expect a better service from the public sector, from civil servants in Scotland?
Well, I think that's one of the things we're going to be trialling to see, does this 4-day week actually work and result in a more efficient government, more productive government? And, you know, the indication, certainly anecdotally in my own office, is that that does work. But it's part of a wider package about how do you get a good deal in place for workers. It's only a shame that the Labour Party is blocking the devolution of employment law, something that has rather irked the Scottish Trade Union Congress.
Well, I'll ask Ruth in a minute. What do you make of this, Natasha? Do you think people will think this is good value for money?
I've got a lot of questions. What happens if you call up on a Friday? Is there going to be someone there? And does this mean that people are going to be on the same wages, or do you get that same pay if you work 4 days? Are you condensing your hours into those 4 days, or are you working longer? I think people at the end of the day are going to think, is this value for money, if this works? And like you say, the evidence at the moment on a 4-day week is that at the moment, the evidence shows that it might not necessarily increase productivity. I think that obviously in the very early stages of this, but a lot of people will go, I'm paying my taxes for this, and why are you working 1 day less a week?
David?
Well, we have quite a large public sector in Scotland, so I think let's not forget that taxpayers are also public sector workers. They just happen to get a pretty
But what
raw
about
deal
the
from the
answers
Tory
to the
government.
questions, then, Natasha?
Well, for example, I mean, you're saying, does that mean you don't get anybody answering the phone on a Friday? My office is still open Monday to Friday. I think employers, given that we now do things like working from home, are able to be more flexible. But this idea that all this rhetoric about building back better from COVID and then not trying to do different things, it really would be an application of responsibility.
Are they going to get paid the same for working fewer hours? That's my question.
So that's part of the idea.
That doesn't strike me as very fair.
Well, they are. I suppose it's the question of productivity. Is this something that Labour could put in their manifesto?
No.
Well, that was short and sweet answer. Why not?
Because this isn't about flexible
Because
working. Do me a favour. I'm a former trade union official. I'm also an employer. Actually, what my staff want, what people want, is flexible working. They want to make work for their lives. A 4-day week is arbitrary. It may be consolidated hours, which would be very difficult to do over a 4-day week. It may be going part-time. It may be job sharing. Again, harder to do over a 4-day week. We've got to look at what works both for the workforce and what works for the people who are paying for the workforce, and this isn't it. And in terms of a new deal for working people, that's what Labour will deliver. It will be about a minimum wage that is a real minimum wage, and it will be the end of things like 0 hours contracts. Those things are the things that we'll prioritise.
I mean, Labour's Deputy Leader Angela Rayner, who's got a new job, a shadow levelling up secretary, she was in favour of it. I mean, I think it was in the last. It was in the last manifesto.
Yeah, it's not going to be in the next one.
Why?
For all the reasons I just said.
She's the levelling up secretary, i.e. local government, and therefore would be in charge of...
she might be the levelling up secretary.
If Labour won the election, she would be in charge of that policy, and she's in favour of it. I personally...
What's wrong with it?
I think it's nuts. I think there is no data to suggest it works. The Cambridgeshire trial, which is the only public sector one that has existed, government had to intervene to stop it because all the public feedback was the services are suffering as a result of this. I can't get anyone to repair my house.
Is that true, all the public feedback? That's why they extended it on the basis that it was working.
Cambridgeshire wanted to extend it because they thought their own idea was brilliant, and obviously the staff thought it was brilliant because they were getting paid the same to do 20% less hours. But the actual public feedback was a decline in people's in positive feelings about the service, about the time it took to get a response from the council, to the point where the local government minister had to step in and say, no, you can't extend this because he called it an experiment with taxpayers' money.
David?
No, I mean, I think let's call this what it was. This was Michael Gove picking a fight for a wedge issue in, I think, a Lib Dem council. This is not evidence-based policy, which, I happen to actually be in favour of, and that's why we're doing this pilot. This kind of rhetoric...
You're not winning people over here, are you, on the panel? Labour, Conservative and Natasha. But
we're pretty much the same anyway.
Oh,
so.
do you mean...
that's a slightly cheap shot.
As objective as you can get, but OK.
But
in the nicest possible way. But no.
The key issue is, where are the differences between you and the Tory party? Immigration, the same. Brexit, the same.
Immigration, not the same. No, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. Just because there's a by-election in Rutherglen that you're scared of losing does not mean that we're the same as the Conservative Party.
Right. What is the evidence? You've said yourself there isn't there at the moment. How will you convince people that this is the way forward, apart from the people who are working?
Well, for example, there is already quite a lot of evidence in some Scandinavian countries.
Oh, right, yeah.
Right, OK, so you look at that. Then you look at, well, let's try and pilot this. Let's see if we can actually make this work. Because if building back better means something, it means doing things differently.
We're already massively short-staffed.
It is a pilot.
Can I ask if this is a pilot, why you're only doing a 4-day week and not maybe trying different things? So doing a 9-day fortnight, which a lot of organisations are piloting, just to see which of these models might work, or consolidated hours, or annualised hours, or a whole host of other different options that are available to the general public.
Well, this is a remarkable turnaround.
It's quite a good point.
It's quite a remarkable turnaround, gone from absolutely no chance of doing a 4-day week to saying, well, why don't we try 9?
No, but
the reality is the Labour Party does not have answers on how you protect working people. And that's why so often now, Ruth, I know that perhaps in the House of Lords you don't see this, but that's why you're on such a different page from the Scottish Trade Union Congress, which is the true, authentic voice of workers, and wonder why your party is blocking devolution of employment law.
For the record, I think government would fully support, and I would fully support, flexible flexible working within the realms of delivering public services.
Well, there is,
because let's not forget,
some flexibility.
we have massive staff shortages across so many of our public services. You know, I think the Cambridgeshire trial again talked about extending it to bin men, for example, when we already can't deliver that. So it's just not going to work. Taxpayers Alliance reckon it's a 30 billion quid bill.
Well,
and they're very credible.
On that note of consensus not, that's all we have time for today. Thank you to all of my guests for joining me. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live and, of course, Prime Minister's Questions at 11:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. Bye-bye.